want to talk to you today about the distinction between essential and accidental properties. In a way, it's a very simple distinction, but from another point of view, it gets complicated really quickly as soon as we try to be precise about this definition, and also as soon as we try to be clear about what we're talking about these as being properties of. So, why the complexity? Well, in a certain sense, it's just because there are two different kinds of things going on. Let me explain. We can talk about essences of individual objects, but also essences of kinds of objects. So when we're thinking about the distinction between essential and accidental properties, we need to be clear about whether we have in mind objects, that is to say things, or whether we're talking about kinds, species of things. Now, why does that matter? Well, because Aristotle thinks, for example, it's not clear whether individual things have essences at all. We can still make sense of the idea of an essential property, I think, but it becomes complicated to say exactly what an essence of an individual thing could be. Aristotle gives us a number of characterizations of what an essential property is, of what an essence is, and they're also different. So a second source of complexity is that whether we're talking about objects or kinds, we want the job of an essence to be, well, multifaceted. At least Aristotle does. And it's not clear exactly how we should take it. Here is how Aristotle defines essence. The essence of each thing is what it's said to be propter se. The Greek here is kathauto. That is to say, well, by virtue of itself. So we can talk about the properties a thing has by virtue of itself, and then the properties it might have by virtue of other things. So this gives us one way of characterizing an essence. It's what a thing is by virtue of itself. And so we can say, aha, an essential property then is something a thing has by virtue of itself. An accidental property is one that is not essential. And so it's something that a thing is going to have not by virtue of itself, but by virtue of something else, presumably. So here's the first thing. An essential property is something we have by virtue of ourselves. Notice here he's talking about this primarily applying to objects, to things, not kinds of thing. But that's really a matter for figuring out Aristotle, not so much figuring out the distinction. Here's another characterization. The formula, therefore, in which the term itself is not present, but its meaning is expressed. This is the formula of the essence of each thing. In other words, the definition is something that indicates the essence. Indeed, he says, therefore there is an essence only of those things whose formula is a definition. We could say it's what a definition expresses. But now, of course, how do you define a thing? How do you define an individual object? How could you give a definition of me? You might be able to give a definition of human being. He does that in terms of being a rational animal. Today, we might use biology to give a more precise scientific characterization of what it is to be human. But the point is, whatever we say about that, the properties mentioned in that definition will be essential to that kind of thing. So if by virtue of itself is one he uses primarily with respect to things, what a definition expresses is going to apply primarily to kinds of things. And indeed, Aristotle says there is an essence only of those things whose formula is a definition, so nothing then that's not a species of a genus, that is to say a kind of thing, will have an essence only species or kinds will have it. That's a puzzling thing. This seems to apply here, this seems to apply primarily here. But he gives yet another characterization. He says the essence is precisely what something is. So the essence is, well, what it is. And sometimes he refers to it as what it is to be that thing. Now all of those are, well, ways of understanding the distinction between essential and accidental properties that are distinctive of Aristotle. And later in the tradition, people begin to notice this isn't one characterization of what an essential property is. This is a number of different characterizations, and it's not obvious that they're equivalent. So most modern thinkers don't really use any of these to characterize what an essential property is. They all have an interesting relationship to the modern understanding, but they really don't seem to be equivalent to one another. After all, well, what it is to be a thing, and sometimes he says, what makes it that thing? Well, that seems different from what a definition expresses. That might be different from what the thing is by virtue of itself. So these are not necessarily equivalent. The modern way of expressing it tends to be this. An essential property is what is necessary to the thing or to the kind of thing. And that's something that can clearly apply in both directions. So we don't face this problem of how we define an individual object, or thinking hard about what a kind of thing is by virtue of itself. Instead, we can ask what's necessary. Now, for an object, it's a question of necessary to being that thing. So, what is necessary to being it for the object? And here we can say what's necessary to being of that kind of thing. So here in general is how we might understand it. An essential property is one that is necessary. You can't be what you are unless you have that property. If you lose that property, you're no longer, well, the person you are, for example, or if we're talking about kinds, of the same kind. However, an accidental property is something that can come and go. You can have that property or lose that property, and you remain the same. What's an example of an accidental property? Wearing a green shirt is clearly not essential to me. It's an accidental property. I happen to be wearing it now. But if I weren't, I'd still be me. Same thing is true of speaking. I am speaking right now, but I could remain silent, and I'm still me. I don't change by virtue of being silent. However, there might be properties that actually I would be different. Maybe I'd be a different object, a different person. Maybe I wouldn't be a person at all if those things were to change. So what would be an example of that kind of property? That gets much harder. Lots and lots of properties are accidental, but what's an essential property to a thing? That's much harder to say. Maybe we can come up with some examples that are not going to be as controversial as thinking about what it is to be a human being or to be a specific human being, like what it is to be me. That's a deep question of personal identity. Instead, we could ask, what's necessary for being a teacher? If we ask that, we can think, well, to teach, right? Maybe we want to be more precise and say it's a question of actually having a job as a teacher. But you might also say, well, that person's a really good teacher, even if that isn't their profession. And so we might be able to say, okay, what's necessary for being a teacher is to teach. What's necessary for being a musician? Well, presumably to play music, to write music, to be involved in music in some way. Again, scientifically, it can be harder. What's essential to being water? There we think we know the answer, to have the structure H2O. What's necessary to being table salt? NaCl, sodium chloride. What's essential to being an animal? That's a much more complicated question. What's essential to being a human being? An even more complicated question. What's essential to being a pencil, for example? What's essential to being a chair? To go back to our question of defining chair, we realize that's hard. And so coming up with a list of the essential properties of chairs is hard. Identifying a few essential properties, though, isn't hard. A chair is a piece of furniture. And so that chairs are examples of furniture, that they're pieces of furniture. That's something that seems necessary. So we can identify some of the essential properties without having to identify all of them. If we start thinking about objects, then it can be tricky. What's essential to being me? Complicated question, as we've said. What is essential to being this Apple Watch? Well, that's also kind of a complicated question. If I take the band off and replace it with another band, it's the same watch. If I have this repaired and get a new face on it, for example, if I do other things to it, is it still the same watch? Probably. Eventually I might change out so many things that we end up concluding it's not the same. We get into complicated questions here related to the ship of Theseus problem, which I'll talk about separately. When we reflect on these questions, we say, well, yeah, to say what is necessary to being an object, to fill in the full account of what makes it the same object seems difficult. But sometimes it's not hard. that a human being has to be an animal? That seems fair. So Aristotle, whether he's right or not about the rationality part, does seem to be right that being an animal is essential to being a human being. So it might be complicated to say exactly when this Apple Watch remains this Apple Watch and when it might turn into something else and a different watch or a different sort of thing altogether. What's essential to being this one is not easy to specify. But presumably there are certain things that are essential to being this one, like maybe having some aspect of its history, or having at certain points of time this particular material constitution. So we might be able to identify certain properties that are essential even if we can't specify the entire set of those properties. With certain other kinds of objects, it might be a different kind of deep problem. What makes one electron different from another electron? What makes it that electron? The electrons seem to have, well, all their properties in common really, except maybe their position and their relation to other things. All their intrinsic properties seem to be the same. And so what makes this one this one? Is it just being related in this way to those other objects? Is it just a matter of occupying that point of space-time? Is it something else? That's a deep metaphysical question. So sometimes it's going to turn out to be surprisingly hard to characterize this. But on the other hand, again, even if we can't specify the essence in the sense of all of these properties, we could say, well, here's one thing that's essential to being that electron, having a negative charge. If it isn't that, it isn't an electron at all. And we can also ask interesting questions like, well, to be me, is it essential that I be a human being? Could a wicked witch turn me into a frog, for example? John Locke asks questions like that and says, well, I don't see why not. Might be physically impossible, but conceptually I don't have a problem with it, says Locke. And that might be true, in which case being human would not actually be essential to me. Now maybe it is, as a matter of fact, but it's not an obvious point that it is. If being an animal is essential to being human, then is being an animal essential to me? Maybe it is, actually. I mean, I can imagine a story where a wicked witch turns me into a frog. Can I imagine one where a wicked witch turns me into an Apple Watch, or turns me into a pair of eyeglasses, or turns me into Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, or the Ides of March? Well, no, not really. Could I imagine one where she turns me into some abstract object like, I don't know, the number 6? I don't really know how to understand such a story. So there might be certain categorical bounds that we cannot cross, and being part of that general category of things, maybe it's being a concrete object located in space-time, or maybe it's being an animal, or maybe it's being an abstract object. Can I imagine a story where the number 3 suddenly turns into a princess? No. Okay, so maybe some of those boundaries do indicate something about where kinds and where individual objects have essential properties. So in short, the question of the distinction between essential and accidental properties is intimately connected to some basic metaphysical questions. Questions about identity, questions about basic categories of things, questions about necessity and what can be the case. And that's not surprising. If an essential property is necessary to a thing, or to being a kind of thing, then we're going to know what the range of possibilities is, in part by knowing what properties are essential to a thing. The accidental properties we can change, and the things will remain what they are. The kinds of things will stay stable. But if we change essential properties, the thing will no longer be what it is, and it will no longer be a thing of that kind.